Welcome back to Masters of the Air Debrief, Episode 8. Madison, we're almost at the end of the series.
Last time we talked about how I didn't realize that everything we'd seen so far was before D-Day.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that's the central part of the story for episode 8.
Yeah, it's interesting how, to your point, they don't always give us dates at the beginning every time. And it feels like the most important mission every single time they go on a mission. So to think about all that just being prep work is kind of crazy. How many people were lost before the full ground invasion?
It makes sense why those bombing runs were so important because about halfway through the episode when Rosie is describing D-Day to Crosby who slept through it, he's like it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. There were ships, hundreds of ships below us, and we flew through the air uncontested, and no Luftwaffe came to to contest us. And he was like, "We were the masters of the air." I'm like, "Oh, there was the title, name drop." Haha.
The titular line, we love it. We love to see it. Yeah, it starts off this episode with a run from the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, part of the 15th Air Force and 99th Pursuit Squadron. I didn't realize there were so many levels to the hierarchy when it comes to things like that, but there are. Pretty cool run, especially just seeing it filmed at night and some of the different things they did with the P-51s and showing the Tuskegee Airmen. And just fun to see them in action doing a little bomb run on a train or on a little station.
Yeah, like when are we gonna get an entire series on the Tuskegee Airmen? Like I feel like that's the next series, right? Like it was fun to see their interactions, especially, at the beginning we get to see the Tuskegee Airmen in their own air bases and wishing that they could take on higher missions, higher stakes missions, that they could do more, which of course they do later on. But then to even watch them in the POW camps later on and interacting with the cast of characters we've grown to care about over the course of the series, just so much fun. And I love Shidigatwa and just so excited to see him join the cast.
Yeah, it's interesting. Early on, one of the captains of the Tuskegee Airmen says, you're a clever fellow, but don't let smart get in the way of happy. And it's interesting to think about these college educated pilots and men of the military not being looked at as more of just like a a token group or a pawn of they're doing the simple runs, they're not involved, just kind of relegated to side missions. It must have been difficult for these good pilots, and of course, knowing what happens after the war, to know that their efforts and all their training didn't go to waste and instead set up pilot schools and trained more black aviators and really kind of pushed the needle post-war. So cool to see that where it came from.
In this episode, they are given a mission where they have to go a crazy amount of miles, like more miles than a P-51 can go.
Yeah.
Was that a sacrificial mission?
It felt like it.
Okay.
It felt like a go do your mission, bail out, and then you've done your thing.
Well, two things. One, crazy that I mean, obviously sacrificing human life for a cause isn't beyond the United States Air Force, but also like sacrificing like machinery, like
Free planes, yeah.
yeah, just like, hey, these planes just go until they can't go anymore, then bail out. It's just crazy to me.
Yeah, especially just for three planes worth of hitting a target. I mean, when we saw the bombing run where they asked the boys to get all the way down to Africa, that seemed near impossible. But with the fuel, they said they could make it if you feathered it or whatever. And we still saw some bombers make it. But yeah, it wasn't just two bombers. So interesting that, like you're saying, the calculated and acceptable risk of, it's three pilots, three planes. Here you go.
Yeah, of course, in that run, they do bail out and then they do get captured. Three of the Tuskegee Airmen do get captured and taken to a POW camp where they meet up with our guys. We can touch on that later. Crosby stayed up for like 6 days to plan all the bombing runs for D-Day.
Yeah, they said June 3rd was the last minute of sleep he got for 72 hours, and that he had to plan 210 missions in total. Flight plans, maps, everything the Air Force would do, and coordination with the ground crew, obviously, to kind of pass that along. But 210 missions in 72 hours, that's pretty insane.
Yeah, so when he at some point walks out of his CO's office and just passes out. That's funny. This is where we really start to, Rosie kind of steps into his own as kind of one of the longstanding pilots there on base. And boy, he's just such a warm guy. I really like Rosie.
Yeah, it's fun to have talked to Rebecca where she was saying that Rosenthal used to come over to their house all the time, and they all knew him as a kid, and his family and their family did vacations together. It just proves that they really got the character right in the show of how warm he was, how close he was with Crosby, and kind of a fatherly figure of just being so kind and shepherding everybody else and making sure everyone got in their planes all right and got home safe.
Over in the POW camp, Bucky seems to be losing it a little bit. The first little scene we see of him is he's basically reciting from memory a baseball game out in the middle of the stockyards by himself.
Yeah.
And I think because I'm still unclear of how long they're in these camps for, but it's got to be, a year, maybe?
They say he was a prisoner for 18 months,
Wow.
3 months more than Clevin. Spoiler
Wow.
alert. So he was there for a long time. I mean, can you just imagine scout camp for 18 months? That might be. Then you add the prisoner aspect and eating cat soup and hard manual labor, and that would have been
Oh my gosh.
quite the time.
Yeah.
Not to mention the weather and the conditions and having so many people packed into one place. But
Yeah, I think Buck was getting worried about him, about the
yeah,
fact that he's just losing it, right? I think what they realized, so him and Buck and Bucky have a little bit of a tussle in the stockyards, and but this happens to be, at least narratively, the same day that the D-Day is happening, and
yeah,
so the German command is on high alert, and, like, right when that's happening, they're like, "Oh, the Germans are spooked, like, something's spooking them,"
yeah,
and they end up picking up later on their radio, their makeshift radio that they built. They're like, "Oh, we're invading Europe, like, this is the beginning of the end, and, like, we've gotta come up with some contingency plans," which really gives them something to, like, rally around and something for them to do,
yeah.
which really, I think, improves Buck and Bucky's mental well-being.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not like the invasion of D-Day would make everybody just leave their post, but it's enough to stress them out. I mean, I did think one thing when that happened was this when they start just shooting prisoners, of just realizing, oh, they're coming, let's just get rid of them. Luckily, they don't do that, and they didn't do that.
Yeah, because there's, like, rules to war or something like that.
Yeah, there's some kind of convention. I don't know how well it's all followed, but there are rules sometimes. Speaking of rules sometimes, it's interesting to see the intake of the Tuskegee Airmen as prisoners. And I know I mentioned this in episodes past, but watching the mirror of how the German commanding officer at the camp treats them versus how he treated Egan or Bucky, and just kind of seeing the mirror of trying to befriend them and then immediately flipping it and saying, your country doesn't even allow your people to sit with white people and drink from the same fountain and use the same bathroom. What are you fighting for? And I love the quote that one of the airmen says that, do you know any country that's better? I know my country's still coming up, and I know it's trying hard to become what it says it's supposed to be. And when I get back, I'm going to help them do that a lot faster. Just a good quote. And also, it hurts knowing the real history of how much longer, and even now, there's still not a perfect situation. But just knowing that that was the mindset of many of these airmen of, I'm going to serve because I know there's potential to be better and I want to help it get there.
Yeah, and the juxtaposition between, the German kind of back and forth with Bucky when he was first being brought into camp versus the Tuskegee Airmen, they weren't taking anything. They were just like, "Here's my name, here's my service number, and that's it. We're not gonna do this playful back and forth kind of thing." And, they just don't take shit, and I really like that. It was really funny because, in Europe, there just aren't many black people, and so when they're first given the Tuskegee Airmen their mission and they're like, "Oh, well, we're just gonna expect you to, parachute down to bail out. We're gonna give you fake IDs so that you can hopefully blend into the population." And they're just like, "Are you kidding me? Blend into the population?" And they're like, "Well, are we Tuskegee Airmen or what?" And they're like, but then when they're being brought into the camp and bunking with, Bucky and Buck, one of the Tuskegee Airmen was like, "Well, how come you didn't have any problem with us coming in and bunking with you." And Buck is like, "Well, I knew you weren't spies." And I
Yeah.
was like, that's really true. Like, the Germans probably don't have a lot of black men on hand to be spies.
Yeah, it's interesting knowing the history of the only country that really had the biggest population was going to be France. And so if you didn't go down over France, there was no way that you were part of that country for the most part.
Mhm.
And if you weren't light enough skin to think that you might be Indian, then you were out of luck. These black airmen, knowing about the 1936 Olympics and how Hitler felt about black people, and Jesse Owens and how he shocked the world, I know it couldn't have been too far in their minds to go, yeah, you're not America, but you're also not racially accepting. There's just no way.
When the Nazi officer's like, "So I hear that your country doesn't like black people." I'm like, "And Germany does?"
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure that was the whole part of Nazism was it was white supremacy on steroids.
I'm glad they showed it in this way in the show, but there's no way these pilots took them serious at all if this is what really happened. There's just no way.
Yeah, yeah.
I know the next scene where they leave the interrogation and they're being marched into the Air Force POW camp, and it's just so hard to watch as the Americans are saying, "Are we going to drink out of the same water? You don't belong here. Are you kidding me? They're putting them with us." That still is hard to watch. Just knowing that that was the reality of the time. That's what everybody felt for the most part, and it's just not great.
No, and then knowing that it took another 20 years
Yeah.
and we're still dealing with the after effects.
Yeah. We're not going to talk about the arguments I've had with friends or coworkers recently about Black Lives Matter was 3 years ago when it really
Yeah.
like, took the forefront during the pandemic, and people are already changing the story. We're 3 years away. What happened?
Mm-mm. Yeah.
So it's not easy at all.
No.
And it's great that at least the show is showing it. And they could have glossed over that part and just said, and they joined the camp and they found a bunk. But I'm glad they showed it the way they did of out of the fire and still in a frying pan,
Yeah.
still having frustration, hate, and bigotry even from their own airmen.
Yeah. Yeah, but then the rest of the episode is kind of about planning for escape. They say basically there are 3 outcomes. One is like mass execution where, they just realize they're gonna lose, and so they start killing us all. One is we fight all of them, and it's just a big old bloodbath.
Mhm.
Or 3, they march us somewhere deeper into the Reich and use us as bargaining power. And they're like, "We need to prep for each of these scenarios and try and get the men in shape and prepared." So there's, like, a lot of montages of them like, "Here's how you kill a guy with a stick."
Yeah. Good luck with the German machine guns. Here's how you kill a guy with a stick. I think at the end of the episode, they have a note. They've heard or they have rumblings of the fact that Russia has now crossed into Germany. And so it has the SS really worried. I mean, the SS was worried about the Americans, but they were much more worried about the Russians. Just knowing the level of hatred and the cruelty that Stalin and his boys were going to have. You did not want to get caught by the Russians. You didn't want to get caught by either, but you did not want to get caught by the Russians.
Not to jump ahead, but certainly in the next episode, we kinda see a little bit of that happening. And so talk about a stressful situation to be stuck in prisoner boy camp, scout camp, and having your forces coming in from one side and someone else's forces coming from the other, and just feeling the pressure is building and mounting for something really catastrophic to happen.
Yeah, definitely it's going to lead to a great finale, and that is what's going to be coming next week, or rather this Friday. So we hope everyone's been watching, and we're excited to finish up our series of Masters of the Air. We have a couple more interviews coming up. We have Matt Mabe from the 100th Bomb Group Foundation, and we might have one more surprise interview before the end of the season.
So we
Till then, enjoy.